Hello, everyone. Bienvenue. I'm Chris Wiebe at the National Trust for Canada, and this is Organizing to Identify and Protect LGBTQ plus Heritage Places, Strategies and Lessons from New York. Welcome. And I'm just going to give it a few minutes while we're waiting for some people to come into the webinar. And if you want to say hello from where you're coming from, let us know the weather. You can do so in the chat and bring us all up to speed. So we'll get started in about a minute or so. Okay, people are coming in okay from Quebec City, super cold. From Fredericton, Dartmouth. Wow, a lot of people coming in from Atlantic Canada. This is great. I have some friends out in Winnipeg and they were at minus 40. Look at this, more Ontario people. Sunny Mission, BC, hello. And from Canmore, New Brunswick, fantastic. Well, in the interest of time, why don't we dive right in? Hello and bienvenue again. I'm Chris Wiebe at the National Trust. I'm the manager of Heritage Policy and Government Relations here at the National Trust for Canada in Ottawa. And I'm joined today, delighted to be joined today by Andrew Dolkart, who's the co-founder of the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project, and he's coming to us from snowy New York. I want to begin by acknowledging that the land on which both I and the National Trust headquarters are situated is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I encourage all webinar participants to reflect on their responsibilities on the traditional territories from which they're joining today. On the housekeeping front, here's a bit about our webinar format. Unlike gatherings that we've had throughout the year, you'll not be able to ask your questions live verbally. I know it'll be a disappointment for some, but you're welcome to ask your questions or observations in the Q&A box. Please keep the chat for more technical or other kinds of matters, but the Q&A box should be where you want to put your hard-pointed questions. While this webinar will be conducted in English, n'hésitez pas à poser vos questions dans la Q&A box en anglais ou français. So please feel free now to say hello in the chat if you haven't done so already, and we'll begin. So next slide, please. Just to launch into things, just a few words about the National Trust for Canada. These webinars and gatherings that we're putting on, like the one today, are a vitally important part of the work we do to help support and build the heritage conservation community in Canada. Through sessions like this and through our national conference and programs like Launchpad or the Endangered Places List, we work to empower people to use heritage to create livable communities, to reflect the diversity of our country, and to tell our country's full stories. There are so many opportunities for heritage to contribute to our communities. This conversation today about revealing and protecting under-recognized LGBTQ plus heritage places gives us an opportunity to reflect on how we present and talk about heritage conservation more broadly, what its values and goals are, and how it can connect with the broader public. Next slide, please. With that in mind, that broader public and connection, I just want to mention a project I think today's conversation can help us to advance. It's a project led by the National Trust called the Heritage Reset. Those of you who participated in the National Trust Conference 2021 this past fall, mounted in association with the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals, would have seen materials on the Heritage Reset like this above. Conference attendees at that conference would have been involved in discussion sessions that posed questions to stakeholders in the heritage field, exploring how we are seen by the broader public, but perhaps more importantly, opening up a space for self-reflection on the biases ingrained in the heritage conservation sector and how it may have excluded voices and perspectives and how it can work to remedy that. The work of this national collaborative project, the Heritage Reset, is continuing in earnest this year, and I invite you to keep your eyes peeled for updates and materials and to get involved, along with us and our many partners, including those members of the National Council, the National Trust, National Council, the provincial and territorial organizations, and municipal heritage organizations, and the national organizations like ECOMOS Canada, Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals, and the Indigenous Heritage Circle. So next slide, please. So today's agenda, pretty straightforward. We're having our welcome and introductions, and then we'll segue into about a half an hour presentation from Andrew on the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project, giving us some background on that, some ups and downs and insights. And then we'll break into a Q&A period. I'll have some questions for Andrew, but I'm sure you will too. And we'll want to keep those in front of us. So keep your questions rolling. Next slide, please. So I'm very excited to be exploring this topic today. I've been wanting to do it for a while on identifying and protecting LGBTQ plus heritage places, and to learning from the almost 30-year-old NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project. There are various scattered initiatives happening around in Canada. For example, the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives, founded the same year as the National Trust in 1973, in fact, has grown to be one of the largest archives of its type in the world. It offers tours and programmings in the Toronto area, for instance. And the Calgary Gay History Project also produces tours and materials. And we were delighted that one of its key organizers, Kevin Allen, was able to provide a tour of key gay heritage sites during the National Trust Conference in Calgary in 2015. Montreal has initiatives, as do a number of other cities. I guess the big overarching question for this session today would be, do we need in Canada a more active push to identify and preserve these heritage sites now? And how would we go about in doing it? Where do we put our limited energies? I'm really hoping, and I know our speaker today, Andrew, will be able to illuminate some of those questions given his experience in New York and other initiatives he's been observing over the years across the United States. So without further ado, who is Andrew Dolkart? Andrew Dolkart is a professor of historic preservation at Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. He's also, as I mentioned, a co-founder and co-director of the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project. He is a preservationist and historian specializing in the architecture and development of New York City, with particular interest in the design and use of the common yet overlooked building types that line the city streets. He's the author of several award-winning books, including Morningside Heights, A History of Its Architecture and Development, which received the Association of American Publishers Award for Best Scholarly Book in Architecture and Urban Design. He's also published Biography of a Tenement House in New York City, an architectural history of 97 Orchard Street, as well as The Row House Reborn, Architecture and Neighborhoods in New York City, 1908 to 1929, which won the Society of Architectural Historians prestigious Antoinette Forrester Downing Award in 2012. We are so delighted to have you here, Andrew Dolkart, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say about your New York experience. Over to you.
So thank you, Chris. I'm thrilled to be here. I was part of the one of the panels at the National Trust of Canada's reset in October, and I'm really happy to be kind of building on that as well. I'm also really thrilled that a couple of my former students who are Canadian are on the webinar too. So that is really great for me. So I am going to share the screen. Okay. Wow, it's not working completely. Well, there's supposed to be all these colored boxes here. It's supposed to be the opening of the homepage on our website. Let me.
Oh, that's too bad.
I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to pull up a different one. Let me try this. Well, when I pull it up in full screen, that disappears.
Well, you can keep it in. You can keep it in minimized or whatever, Andrew, if you want.
Yeah, I think I'll do that for at least part of it.
For sure, no
At
problem.
least for the beginning here, where you can see what I'll talk about. Anyway, I'm really thrilled to be talking to you today about my experiences co-founding and co-directing the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project. When my two colleagues and I founded the Sites Project in 2015, we had hoped that our pioneering efforts would become a model for communities large and small in the United States and elsewhere in the world, because queer history has been pretty much ignored by mainstream preservation groups and the preservation community until quite recently. And we've seen this change, and I'm thrilled to see in some of the intros in the chat people that in Canada that are involved in doing this kind of thing. It's ironic to me that the preservation of sites relating to LGBT history and culture has received so little attention from the preservation community until recent years, since there are so many gay and lesbian professionals involved in preservation. Just ask yourself, in the place where you are from, how many recognized historic sites focus on LGBT history? Do any museums discuss these issues? Are there any street plaques that analyze queer sites? I bet that for most of you, the answer is no, or even in places like Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver, the answer is probably very few. So that's the first question that I think that everybody needs to ask. Are LGBT-related sites recognized, and are they interpreted? And this is an example of sites that remained uninterpreted for years. This is a Mineral Point, Pendarvis in Mineral Point, Wisconsin, which is a group of historic houses that celebrate the Cornwall mining heritage of this part of Wisconsin. I was here on a vernacular architecture forum tour, and we got dropped off on a bus, and we had a map with all these sites that we would go to visit. And at the end, we were going to all meet together at the main building. And it was not until I got there and I saw this, what is basically a cardboard cutout of these two guys, that I understood what this place was all about, because this was a gay couple who became obsessed with this heritage, and they were responsible for the preservation of this site. But at the time I was there, about 5 years ago, it was not interpreted at all. Now, fortunately, if you go onto their website, the fact that Bob and Edgar actually are responsible for this site is interpreted. But as soon as I saw this picture, I understood what this site was all about. So recognizing and interpreting is really important. The New York City LGBT Historic Sites Project set off to respond to what we thought of as a serious gap in the historical record as interpreted in the world of preservation. All three of the founders studied at the Historic Preservation Program at Columbia University, so we have been very focused on the power of extant places. We have been trying to change the lack of recognition of queer history in general and bring the broad spectrum of sites related to LGBT people to the public's attention for more than 25 years. And we started this with a group called OLGAD, the Organization of Lesbian and Gay Architects and Designers, which had a preservation caucus that we were part of. And for Stonewall 25 in 1994, we decided to do what is actually the world's first guide to gay and lesbian historic sites. And you can see our map and guide here, where we focus on Greenwich Village, Harlem, and Midtown, with a few miscellaneous sites like the Bethesda Fountain in Central Park, which was where the sculptor was a lesbian sculptor named Emma Stebbins. We have advocated repeatedly for official, local, and national recognition of key sites. We are finally seeing some traction on this issue in certain cities around the country and around the world. The right questions are now being asked in many places, but there is still a long way to go, even in supposedly progressive places. And we must not forget that in parts of the United States, and perhaps in parts of Canada, we could still not safely be having these discussions in person. And it is always important to put the advances that we in North America have had in perspective, and be reminded of the fact that in so many countries in the world, same-sex relationships are illegal, and in a few, they can result in the death penalty. It is important to remember something that may seem obvious, but is crucial: the issues of identifying and interpreting LGBT history and related sites. Due to discrimination in Western cultures, almost all LGBT people have until recently been forced to live closeted lives. This creates formidable challenges for including queer narratives in preservation discourse, and even in identifying, not to mention interpreting and preserving, LGBT-related sites. When people hid a significant part of who they were, certain histories become invisible. In the United States, it was not until 1999 that the National Register of Historic Places, the federal listing of architecturally, historically, and culturally significant sites, listed its first site specifically for LGBT history. That would be Stonewall, the bar that the police raided in 1969, and the nearby streets where patrons who were fed up fought back, soon to be joined by crowds of others over several hot summer nights. This event had international ramifications, which explains why gay pride celebrations are usually held towards the end of June all over the world, and why many are named for Stonewall or for Christopher Street, the street on which the bar was located. Yet it took decades for this site to gain official recognition. A few colleagues and I wrote the Stonewall nomination with the support of the gay and lesbian staff group at the National Park Service. But even in 1999, we had to keep the whole thing quiet, lest we attract attention from one of several vocally homophobic senators. And it was not until 2015 that New York City recognized the importance of Stonewall and designated the building as an individual landmark. And during Stonewall 50, a couple of years ago, I went down a number of times to watch the crowds that were outside the bar. There is currently a bar called Stonewall in the left-hand side of the building, but this bar has nothing to do with the 1969 bar, which was the entire ground floor of the building. And what I discovered was that this is a place of pilgrimage. And in huge numbers of both gay and straight, especially European tourists, came to pay homage to this site. And it was really interesting to see how this has become a World Heritage site. But still, of the over 94,000 sites that are listed on the National Register today, only 26 focus on LGBT issues, and most of those were listed recently, and many of them by the New York Sites Project. Small glimmers of progress in the identification and interpretation of LGBT sites is occurring, and sometimes this occurs in what are perhaps rather surprising places. What I have been seeing is a modest proliferation of historic plaques, interpreting places where LGBT people lived or events took place or where gay or lesbian bars were located. The large, often colorful cast iron plaque is a form of historical interpretation very popular in many places, but for too many professional preservationists, they are taken for granted, but which they can be quite powerful if done right. And here you can see 3 in Louisville, Kentucky, Nashville, Tennessee, and Kansas City, Missouri. These are in 3 very conservative states. They're kind of liberal bastions in conservative states. But the unfortunate thing about these is that they all recognize sites that have been demolished. And also, and this came up just a minute ago, is the fact that at conferences like the one in Calgary, but conferences I've been to recently are now beginning to have LGBT tours also. So this is now coming more and more at the local level. Another key aspect of preservation, of the preservation world, is the house museum. Many house museums have been associated with LGBT people, but until recently, these histories have been completely ignored. Although we might have heard how the owner of the house was a bachelor, or had a loyal secretary, or was a career woman. This contrasts with the detailed family trees so many of us have had to listen to at house museums inhabited by straight occupants. Any gay references were too controversial to even be mentioned, and in many cases, the docents were just too embarrassed to discuss such unseemly issues. Fortunately, that too is beginning to change, although not everywhere. This is Beauport. This is a house owned by Historic New England, right on the water in Gloucester, Massachusetts. And when I first visited here with my late husband, when we came out, I said to him, "This is the gayest house I've ever been to." But it was not interpreted at all at this building. And I'm happy to say that now, due to the fact that the head of the museums at Historic New England is a gay man, this is now part of the tour. So, it took a long time, but this is now being interpreted. And this is a house that opened just before COVID shut everything down. And the Palmer Warner House, one of many 18th century house museums in New England. But when this house opened, they don't interpret the 18th century. They interpret this gay couple and their lives in the house. A very controversial choice when it was announced what the interpretation of this museum would be. I haven't been yet, but I'm looking forward to going. And this was one that I was involved with. This is the Alice Austen House on Staten Island in New York City. This is a city-owned house museum with a rich architectural heritage. Part of this house dates from the 17th century. What you're seeing is mostly a picturesque 1840s cottage. It was the home of a very, very important early woman photographer named Alice Austen. But what was ignored here was that Alice Austen spent almost 50 years living in this house with her partner, Gertrude Tate. And in fact, the directors of this house museum refused to acknowledge this at all. And now, perhaps because the new director is a lesbian, this is now something that is central to the interpretation of the house and helps you to understand some of her rather transgressive photographs, like the Darned Club on the left, or Alice and two of her friends dressed in male drag on the right. And you'll notice the very carefully placed umbrella on the seated figure over here. But this is not the case everywhere. This is Vizcaya in Miami, a place some of you may have visited, because I know a lot of Canadians go down to Miami in the winter. This was the home of James Deering, whose fortune came from agricultural equipment in the Midwest. He was never married, a lifelong bachelor. He was friends with the gay artist John Singer Sargent, who painted these watercolors of his close friends and confidants here. But they go out of their way to refuse to acknowledge even the possibility that Deering might have been gay. In fact, when I went and visited this site a few years ago, there's a computer screen outside a room on the second floor. And if you go through the screen, eventually you come to this. Deering remained a lifelong bachelor. This tends to inspire questions, which are often about his sexual orientation. Through her memoir, Big Bosses, his secretary, Althea McDowell Artemis, brings us one step closer to Deering. And there she tells this story about every time he got a letter, supposedly from a female paramour, she was told to leave the room so he could read the letter in private. And so this is the proof, what I consider this concocted story, is the proof that, God forbid, Deering should have been a homosexual. There are no letters. There is no evidence at all that he had an intimate relationship with a woman. But this is the story that they tell to dismiss any questions that come up about Deering. So, has anyone in Canada been asking these questions? Can your local sites and house museums be reinterpreted? Are there parts of this history of house museums in Canada that are being ignored? So let's talk a little bit about the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project and what we have been doing in New York City and why we have been doing it and what you might be able to do in your community. The project began in 2015 with an underrepresented community grant from the U.S. National Park Service. So we were very lucky to get funding to launch our program. Funding is really nice, but it is not imperative. There is still a lot people can do on their own using free technologies. We set out to identify, interpret, and where appropriate, advocate for the preservation of sites of significance in New York City to New York City's LGBT communities dating from the early 17th century until the year 2000. We have written National Register nominations, completed a theme study of the city's LGBT history, undertaken an educational program in the city's public schools, led walking tours, lectured about specific aspects of New York's queer history, including at places like the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, where if you'd asked me 5 years ago if I would ever have been invited to go there, I would have laughed. But there I was, speaking to the cadets, and placed rainbow flags at the graves of LGBT individuals. And this wasn't, we were giving tours at Greenwood Cemetery and Woodlawn Cemetery. And I suggested, wouldn't it be nice to put rainbow flags on these, just like the veterans associations do put U.S. flags at the grave sites of veterans. And so we did this on our first tour in Greenwood. And I cannot tell you how moving and powerful this was. I mean, we asked individuals in the tour to plant the flag, and people were really moved by this. And every time we do it, people applaud at each one. So it's a little thing, but it was very, very meaningful. For us, the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project is a pioneering cultural heritage initiative and an educational resource that has set out to comprehensively identify and interpret sites connected to LGBT history and culture in New York City. Our aim is, quite simply, to make an invisible history visible. We strive to bring to the fore the contributions that LGBT people have made to local and national and even international history and culture, and to shed light on an aspect of history that has been largely ignored, overlooked, or especially in the past, cast in an undesirable light. We are very specific that we want to go beyond just recognizing places where important events took place, such as Stonewall, or places where famous people lived, although we do those things. But we want to recognize the impact that queer people have had on history and culture in general. This was especially important to us in New York City, long one of the world's major cultural capitals, and is something that is important everywhere. Don't limit the scope of the sites that you recognize, but look broadly at your community and its history. How did LGBT people contribute to your local community? So this is what you see when you get on the homepage. There's a little blurb about who we are, and you can search for sites and instructions on how to use the guide, and there's a menu of all kinds of things. And these little boxes represent sites, and clearly it's an overlay here in Manhattan, which actually we're meeting next week with trying to make this clearer so that you don't get this overlay. But you can zoom in, and you get to neighborhoods where you can find the individual sites. The colors are coded for these various aspects of LGBT history. And then you can search our site for any of these cultural signifiers, but also by neighborhood, by era, by LGBT category. Those are the lists that you saw on the last slide. So I just click literature, and you can see you get all the sites related to literature. And then if you take your mouse over the site, you get this little box. It tells you it's the Langston Hughes residence. Langston Hughes was a Black Harlem Renaissance poet. And then you click on this and you get to the site. And the site has a concise but detailed history of the importance of the site or the action or the people or the events that are related to it. There are lots of pictures that relate to the site. There's a complete bibliography. Often there's video, and as much as we can get for telling you as much as possible about the site and its queer significance. The Sites Project is also a social justice initiative, attempting to fight back against the lack of knowledge about LGBT history, especially pre-Stonewall LGBT history. I can't tell you how many times people have said to us, was there any gay history before Stonewall? And also, we want to counter the discrimination that still exists in many places by bringing the contributions of queer people to the fore. We hope that this will be a powerful tool for instilling pride in members of the community and educating the public in general. And we're especially interested in young people who are looking for resources and an understanding of who they are. And so we think this is really important for that. We are also intently focused on issues of diversity and inclusion within the LGBT community, especially since there is a history of lack of inclusion within the community itself. Thus, we have posted sites associated with lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, transgender people, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, Protestants, Catholics, Jews, senior citizens, youth, and other communities. So we have over 375 sites on here, and we're adding more and more almost weekly. And we also, you can check out our site. We also are on all appropriate social media. If it's too daunting to go through lists of like 375 sites, we have created curated themes. We have about 35 curated themes now, where sites related to, let's say, transgender history or activism before Stonewall are listed here, and you can then click on the site. So just the kinds of sites that we have. We do a lot of social gathering sites. The first site that we did a National Register nomination for was Julius's Bar. This is probably the oldest continuously active gay bar in New York. This was a straight bar that's history goes back to the late 19th century. It became a popular sports bar and newspaper people's bar. But in the 1960s in Greenwich Village, this began to attract a lot of particularly young collegiate gay men started coming here. And why we celebrated this is that in 1965, 3 members of the Nationale Society, which was an early gay rights organization, decided that they were going to do an action that would challenge the New York State Liquor Authority, which had a rule that the mere presence of a homosexual in a bar was disorderly, and a bar could be closed if it knowingly served a gay or lesbian person. So these 3 members of the Nationale Society got together and they decided that they would go to a bar and they would say, we're homosexuals and we want to drink. So they went to several places and the managers laughed at them. Here they are at a Howard Johnson's restaurant, which was an old American chain. And they were served drinks. So they went to Julius's, which was a mixed bar, gay and straight, and it had been raided not too long ago. So they knew that they would be very wary. And they went to the bar. They said that they were homosexuals. And there's the bartender putting his hand over a glass saying he couldn't serve them. And they came with newspapermen and a photographer, and this got a lot of publicity and begins to change these rules and make gay bars and lesbian bars more welcoming, and also begin to get the mafia out of these bars. And we've done all kinds of social spaces. This is a lesbian bar on the left, the Sea Colony, and the Ramble in Central Park was a major cruising site in the 1950s through the 1990s. And you can see this is probably the late 50s, early 60s photograph. And I love the fact that these guys are out cruising in their suits and ties. We looked at LGBT rights sites. This is the home of the Gay Activists Alliance, one of the first gay rights organizations, both political and social, until 1974, when the site was firebombed in a homophobic action. The building still stands, though. We looked at places that might not be buildings, like where the first gay pride march, where people got together and met for the first gay pride march in 1970 on the first anniversary of Stonewall at Sheridan Square. So we list this site, which, as one historian noted, was probably, there were several thousand people here. It was probably the largest congregation of queer people ever in the world up to that time when this took place. We look at sites of social activism. We've just rewritten the National Register nomination for the Henry Street settlement, a very important settlement in a poor immigrant neighborhood that was run by Lillian Wald, and we have now reinterpreted Wald and the homosocial world in which she lived. We look at places of literature. These were the homes of 2 important Black writers, James Baldwin and Lorraine Hansberry, where they wrote, this is where Lorraine Hansberry wrote her famous play, Raisin in the Sun. We look at theaters. In fact, every single Broadway theater is on our site. But my favorite is, as a huge fan of the Broadway musical and a believer that West Side Story is the culmination of the Broadway musical, I love West Side Story because practically every one of the bolded names here was gay or lesbian. The book writer, Arthur Lawrence, the composer, Leonard Bernstein, the lyricist, Stephen Sondheim, the conceiver and director and choreographer, Jerome Robbins, the set designer, Oliver Smith, the costume designer, Irene Sharaff, and the lighting designer, Gene Rosenthal, not to mention Larry Kurt, the original star here. So, but we look at off-Broadway and off-Broadway theater as well. This little storefront was the birthplace of off-Broadway and gay theater. We look at dance venues and at works by gay and lesbian architects and artists as well, both the studios where they worked and their public artworks. So this is Jasper Johns' studio, and this is the only public work that he has ever done, which is in Lincoln Center, or famously Keith Haring, whose studio was in this building on the left, and whose Crack is Whack painting on a handball court is a very popular venue in New York. But there are challenges to doing this sort of history, even in New York. As previously noted, many lived hidden lives that cannot be verified, even when I or one of my colleagues may be almost certain that someone was gay or lesbian. Here is an example. Since I am a huge fan of the ballet, I am interested in the choreographer Eugene Loring, most famous for his ballet Billy the Kid, which is still staged by ballet companies all over the world. This was a project where most of the artists were gay, including Lincoln Kirstein, the impresario who commissioned the work, composer Aaron Copland, whose Billy the Kid Suite is a mainstay of international orchestras, lesbian lighting designer Jean Rosenthal, and sets in strikingly homoerotic costumes by gay artist Jared French, plus the official photographs of the ballet, which were taken by George Platt Lyons, who specialized in dance photography, but is most famous for the male nudes that he photographed in the 1940s and 50s, but which would not be shown in public until long after his death. Not only did Loring choreograph Billy the Kid, but he also choreographed an amazingly homoerotic dance sequence in the cult fantasy film The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T, which I highly suggest that you stream. I only found out about this film recently, and it's quite amazing. So I'm certain that Loring was gay and was closeted, but cannot confirm this. But until further information comes to light, we have not been able to include him on our site. So it is important, if you do an LGBTQ survey in your community and put together a website or some other system for getting the information out to the interested public, that you do not become a gossip column. You need to have evidence, or at least be honest about the state of research on a particular person. And you will sometimes have to deal with homophobia. When we tried to get this house listed on the National Register, which is entirely an honorific, and was the home where Morty Manford grew up, he's the guy on the left, and where his parents, who marched in an early gay pride march, founded PFLAG, the Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, a very important organization. The current owner of this house told us she did not want to be known as the gay house on the block. So we were not able to get this listed on the National Register. So some advice. Don't get caught up in the trap of architectural significance. Preservationists often focus on architecture, but what we are talking about relates to historical and cultural issues, and buildings do not need to have architectural distinction. As is an example here, this is a early 20th century house that was heavily altered by the Manfords. So it's historically significant. And you know, I'm an architectural historian. I love architecture, but we're not only talking about architecture here. Start small. Just get together and start talking about these issues in your community. See how much interest there is. Start with a small project, such as a walking tour or a site list online. See if you can associate with a local LGBTQ center or organization that can supply a meeting place or perhaps some support. And I know this is going on because I talked to somebody from Points of Pride in Hamilton, Ontario in October, and they were really enthusiastic about doing something about queer sites in Hamilton, which is just really fantastic. Set parameters. What is it that you want to accomplish in the short term and in the long term? Do you want to only recognize extant sites, or do you want to remember demolished sites as well? A lot will depend on preservation in your area. Do you have a time frame? Do you have a cutoff date? The National Register in America states that a site must be at least 50 years old or of national significance, while the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission says 30 years. But we chose 2000 as our cutoff date, not only because it was a convenient date, but also because we wanted to be able to include the AIDS crisis and its impact on the community. So what do you include? Be broad. Look at the diversity of queer communities and about the breadth of queer history. Your project should not only be about celebrating events and people that made a positive contribution, but also about remembering less celebratory events. We have many sites related to AIDS in all its ramifications, including deaths, but also dramatic, powerful, and meaningful protests, such as the die-in in front of the New York Stock Exchange, which you see in this picture here. We also commemorate the locations of heinous homophobic murders because this is a part of queer history and needs to be reckoned with. Collect ephemera. This is an exhibition that was done for Stonewall 50 in 2019 that we helped put together. Letting Loose and Fighting Back, New York Nightlife Before and After Stonewall. It's not a huge exhibition, but it was a very powerful exhibition done by a curator at the Historical Society with us among several other people as advisors. And it is filled with ephemeral items that people will throw away. So there are broadsides advertising dances, which you see on the left. This is this is a matchbook for a gay bar, and this is a club membership for a gay disco And this kind of paper ephemera can so easily be lost. Somebody dies, their estate comes to clear out, and this is just, what is all this worthless paper? And throws it away. So start collecting this ephemera now. See if there's a local historical society that wants to start a collection of this kind of material for your area. And also do oral histories and start now. Talk to people who may still remember the 60s and the 70s, and of course the 80s and the 90s. Talk to them before it's too late and record them and archive them. Do you need a little funding? Talk with community groups, meet with local preservation organizations, speak with local politicians who often have small pockets of money that can help you start your project in a small way. You might also seek out corporate support. This can be controversial, and you need to decide if it's appropriate for what you want to do. Many corporations are very interested now in celebrating queer issues and have corporate gay and lesbian groups. Every spring, for example, we get a flurry of requests from banks and corporations that want us to give a talk for Gay Pride Month to their workers. And so we do these in June, and we have gotten generous contributions from major corporations such as American Express. Advocate for sites of significance to the LGBT community. Are there potential landmarks in your community? Are there sites that are ripe for reinterpreting? A few cities in the United States have designated individual properties as landmarks, largely for their LGBT significance. At least 4 in Los Angeles, 3 in San Francisco, 1 in Chicago, and 7 in New York. Done largely, I should say, through lobbying efforts on the part of the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project. There are several sites in London, and I'm sure in other European cities. How many are there in Canada, in your province or in your city? Find sites and start lobbying. Although we do a lot of things, the centerpiece of our project is our website. A website is an ambitious undertaking. We had ours custom designed when we could not find what we wanted in ready-made website templates, but we were fortunate to have gotten a grant that helped us with this. Otherwise, we would have used HistoryPin, an open source template. And I suggested when I was chatting with Chris, who introduced me a few weeks ago, that wouldn't it be great if the Canadian National Trust created a template that could be used by those interested in undertaking LGBT website in any community in Canada, but would also serve those who are interested in doing something similar to under-recognized communities throughout the country. So this is an idea worth pursuing, is to get a template that can be used. So we press on with this effort to recognize LGBT history, to celebrate events and individuals that deserve to be celebrated, and also memorialize events and issues that are not so positive. We have designed our project to be a model. We remain guardedly optimistic, even in these sometimes rather dark times, that someday, in the not too distant future, every community can have an LGBT sites project. Thank you. So I'm stopping the share so we can answer questions.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Wow, what an ambitious project. And to hear you talk through some of the challenges, the ups and downs, the strategic insights. And thank you so much for all that advice at the end in terms of sequentially doing things. I'm wondering, just going straight and honoring these questions coming in, I'm just looking over at Carla Morris's question, who says, you noted that LGBT history plaques and place markers in ultra-conservative areas of the South that represent built heritage that no longer exist. Have there been instances of vandalism on these markers, and how have they been received? I would also throw to you, have you, in terms of activities that maybe you've undertaken in terms of potential temporary flagging or temporary plaquing of buildings, has that been something you've undertook? And I guess I'm just wondering about the whole kind of politics around some of these more overt public recognition instruments and your experience with that.
So I haven't heard about any vandalism to these sites, to these plaques. I would not be surprised. I mean, this has certainly happened about vandalism to plaques representing African-American history in the South. But to my knowledge, and this has not been the case. I do know in one community, they actually cast an extra because they thought that there might be some vandalism. So there's an extra out there just in case. We have been involved in a few plaques. We're now working on getting a plaque on Julius's, and we put up a plaque at the Cafe Chino. But it's not central to our project. There was a project that I recommend that people look at for Stonewall 25 in the 1990s, a group called Repo History, which was a group of artists who were interested in history, got together and they did temporary plaques that had an artwork, a different artist at each one, and there was an artwork that represented text about a site where some aspect of queer history had taken place, mostly in Greenwich Village. And they were really wonderful and really powerful. And there is a website. They no longer exist, Repo History, but there's a website out there that I highly recommend that people take a look at, and for temporary plaques.
Yeah, I'm wondering about that, and whether I guess that some of the challenges around that, whether that's it seems like you're leaning quite heavily in the New York City project on websites, and I guess you're sort of getting around some of the challenges that may be inherent in recognizing places on the ground in real time, in physically. So
we have a pilot walking tour that you can do on your phone in Greenwich Village, and we've teamed up with the National Park Service, because Stonewall is now a national monument, and to do a walking tour guide printed for that. But we've been lobbying to do other things for plaques, for landmark designations. But our website is the key, as well as other kinds of educational projects for us anyway.
Andrew, there's another question here coming in from Bianca Cadeau. It's in French. For places on your website, did you also put your information on Wikipedia to spread the visibility and to spread the profile of it, or did you use that as well to amplify? Or
no, what an interesting idea. No, we haven't done anything with Wikipedia. The website and the social media have really been our focus. It's funny because I did correct Wikipedia when I was doing research for one site. I made a little correction on Wikipedia.
Okay, here's some other questions. I have some questions too, but okay, here's a question coming in from Charlotte. I can't see her last name. What steps do I take to locate people in places when I live in a small town where LGBTQ plus people are more closeted than in the city? Do I approach seniors' homes personally, or do I get help from the LGBTQ organization to help me reach out? What thoughts on some of those smaller places?
Well, one thing is to use social media, to see if you can, anyone's on social media that you can, that you can send out a blast and see if anybody picks it up. I would think, you could conceivably go to senior citizens and, ask to give a little talk. I'm not sure how well that would be received. Just to go cold to that, it's a tricky thing, and you could try it and see if it works. Ideally, you try to link with a few people, other people in the community, and one person knows another person knows another person who can give you links to people. It's hard to just go cold to it. You might get some really progressive people that are running a senior citizen center, for example, that might want to put a call in their newsletter. Most of these senior centers have weekly newsletters. To ask if anybody wants to talk with you. I mean, I think that is kind of a smart idea, probably better than asking them if you can give a talk.
Yeah, I think it sounds challenging, but I think that's great advice in terms of how to go forward, and I mean build on a critical mass of some sites and raise the profile. Here's a question from Christopher Wells asking, okay, this is a question for me. Haha, is there funding from the National Trust or others in Canada to support local queer history projects? That's a great question, and when I'm going to circle back with my colleagues, and I think also, I mean, in terms of how to bring that forward, how to help advance things in the Canadian context. I think Andrew's idea about the website platform and creating a template sounds really, really intriguing and doesn't sound insurmountable. Anyway, we'll have to explore that, but that's a great question, Christopher, and one that we're going to be actively considering quite shortly. Okay, Edward Uhl had another question here about I guess about like drawing attention to heritage conservation generally. Has your work with NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project, how has that been received by segments of the queer community in New York not normally involved with historic preservation? How relevant do they find your project? Is queer history and heritage something they have thought of before your activities, or is it new to them? I guess, is it drawn in other people and brought them into the heritage sphere, I guess, is one of the questions there.
Yes. I think that when we do our public events, when we have a very active lecture series, which you can find out about on our website or on our social media. But we're having a talk about some talks about Broadway and about music coming up, and I did one recently on lesbian couples in the early 20th century. Most of our audience is not our friends in preservation. We have drawn a very broad audience, and we've drawn an audience that is very eclectic in age, equally among men and women, and we have a significant trans audience. So we have gone way beyond the preservation. There is and on our tours that our tours always sell out when we can get back to doing real live tours. So there is a craving for this kind of information out there. And I did a live tour of Greenwood Cemetery just about a month ago, and not only did we sell out, but I would say that 25% of the people were straight couples. So this goes way beyond just getting an audience, a queer audience.
Yeah, that Greenwood Cemetery project, powerful and really inspiring project there. Something to reproduce. Looking here at some of these other questions, Christopher Wells is asking about, how do you balance that kind of public heritage, public history kind of a role, and also the kind of the academic one in terms of that kind of more rigorous kind of research. Is there a balance? How do you find the balance there?
So there is a balance, and we're a public history project, but we want to be serious. We were very careful that we didn't want to be a gossip sheet, so we've done really pretty rigorous research on every one of our sites, and we include a complete bibliography so that people can check. We have discovered that the more famous somebody is, the more controversial it is. And so, we have put up Eleanor Roosevelt and many sites related to the women in Eleanor Roosevelt's circle. And we were very careful to cite, the academics who have spent lifetimes researching Eleanor Roosevelt in order to explain why Eleanor Roosevelt was on our site. So I think that's really important to be able to have citations for what you do, which is why Eugene Loring is not on our site. Nobody has written a biography of Eugene Loring. And so we don't have any evidence one way or another except for his work.
Interesting, those kind of checks and balances. That's an interesting dynamic. I'm wondering about that. Allison Bain is asking about community consultations, and were those a part of your process, town halls, and was that a major resource issue in terms of mounting? It sounds like it was more of an organic beginning, but were there some larger town hall
Yeah,
kind of type
we
things
haven't had any town halls or anything like what you're saying when we were trying to organize. This grew out of this little committee at that OLGAD group, 30 years ago. But we continued to be interested, and preservation's a small world, and we were all friends. And we decided to do this. But we do have open source in the sense that we invite people to nominate sites or to comment to us. And people do. But this is something I recommend if you do a website. It cannot be open just to anybody to send in things because you're going to get homophobic stuff. And so we vet everything. So nothing is seen by the public until we have vetted it here. And we remember when we did our first lecture, we were Zoom bombed with just horrible homophobic stuff. And we learned our lesson from that. And so you have to be aware of this kind of thing.
I guess one of the last questions I'd have would be one of my own, I guess, around the relationship with official heritage sites and where that comes in the kind of the stream of work, the workflow that you had as a group. I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is start with the organic work of recognizing places and raising their profile and raising them up. And then the work of kind of trying to change and modify, statements of significance, plaques, getting, heritage sites on the national register, on provincial registers, municipal registers in the Canadian context, that would come later. Or how do you see it? How do you see that dynamic?
Well, I think that from the start, that has been very important for us, that sites that sites should be recognized locally, statewide, nationally, or reinterpreted. And we have had a superb relationship with New York State, the New York State Historic Preservation Office. All the federal government grants we've gotten get channeled through the state office, and they have been hugely supportive of this. And we have seen this in a number of different places. And of course, it's very political. When we got our first grant, a group in Kentucky also got a grant to do a queer survey of Kentucky, not a place where you would expect this. And they did it. They did a really great job. They published a report on it. At the time, there was a Democratic governor, and then a very conservative Republican was elected, and the project just died. It never went anywhere further than reinterpreting two sites. So politics does play in, but we've had very good relationships with the government, with New York City, where we've lobbied for the designation of 6 official landmarks, and we're in the process of working on getting more with the city, with the state, and with the federal government. So there's a lot of interest in governments, and so don't be shy about going to your local or provincial or national government.
Okay, perfect. One last question. Maybe we can fit it in, shoehorn it in the last 60 seconds here. Here's one from Christopher Wells. How do you address intersectionality and avoid retelling a white, gay, cisgender male history, which often has a more privileged voice? Has that come up in the work that you guys have been doing there in New York?
Yes, we from the start we have tried to be as diverse as possible, and to get as many diverse voices as possible. We hired one of my students as an intern 2 summers ago, and she wrote. She was fantastic, and she wrote a whole series of entries for lesbian bars and lesbian social places. So we've tried to go beyond. We have an advisory board that's very diverse, with gay men, lesbians, trans, people from different ethnic groups, and we're also, always open to getting sites suggested to us. So the three founders are all cisgender white men, but we have been very conscious of this issue to make it as diverse as possible.
Okay,
and you can look at our site; you'll see it's pretty diverse.
Okay, great questions, and thank you so much, Andrew Dolkart, for joining us today. It's been a tremendously illuminating webinar, and building on, as you say, the National Trust conference, involvement that you had there back in fall, and looking forward to continuing the relationship down the road. Really, thank you for taking time out of your busy
I am
schedule.
happy to do this, and I'm also, if anybody has any questions or anything, I'm always happy to chat with anybody. So, if you're interested in this in your area, I'm happy to talk.
Okay, thanks so much, Andrew. And
thank you.
Emily, if you could just put up the last slides, and we can just scamper through those really quickly and wrap things up. Just wanted to draw your attention, just as we close, to some of the materials on regeneration works on the National Trust website, the second website, and you'll find tip sheets there and other toolkits. And the next slide, please. And also wanted to provide an offer of discounted membership to the National Trust and help support our work and bringing it to other Canadians. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you especially to Andrew Dolkart. It's been a tremendous conversation, and look forward to see you all next time. Thanks again, everyone.